As you mentioned, my name is Rich Bailey. I'm a state ornithologist. I coordinate, for the most part, non-game bird conservation for the state. That means all sorts of, yeah, I'm a little short, all sorts of activities and things. I'm going to go through, though. I'm going to take a step back here from previous presentations and talk a little bit about the big picture with bird conservation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how bird conservation works at the state level and how we prioritize where to work and who we want to work with. And then I'm going to get into some keystone species that we work with in West Virginia. But I will say that throughout this presentation, a lot of this applies to Central Appalachia as a whole. So just because I'm talking about West Virginia, don't necessarily think it doesn't apply to Maryland or Pennsylvania. So I'm going to go through some focal species. I'm going to talk at the end, and this is kind of the critical component here. You've heard a little bit of this theme already, and that's the notion of a landscape scale approach. And the importance of not just managing for one habitat, but thinking about habitat at a landscape scale and the diversity of habitats that exist within a forested landscape, because that's really the key takeaway that I want you guys to think about. It's not just your properties that you're managing. We need to think about adjacent properties. What are your neighbors doing? What public lands are near? What's the big picture of where you're at in terms of, particularly when you're thinking about goals for multiple wildlife species? So the bad news first, but the bad news is also a silver lining in that it's good news and that it's really lit a fire under us. And these are slides these days that I pretty much start every presentation with. Some folks in the room, particularly practitioners and professionals, will be aware of this already. But a landmark paper dropped in 2019 that really quantified what we suspected for a long time, and that there's really been a catastrophic decline in birds by numbers in North America. Talking about the fact that really for every 10 birds there were in 1970, there are now 7 birds. We've lost roughly 30% of all birds by number in North America. You can kind of sit with that a little bit. There's not one reason for why this has happened. I think we can all speculate a whole suite of reasons why this has happened. But it really is the impetus behind our push to do what we do as conservation professionals, at least in the bird world, but I'm sure this applies to other taxa as well. So again, just like I said, 1 in 4 birds pretty much have been gone since 1970. And if we dial down to eastern forests here in West Virginia, which is the 3rd most forested state in a country, West Virginia has a huge population responsibility for forest birds, in particular forest songbirds. And if you extend that out to include Maryland and Pennsylvania, the responsibility only gets larger. And there's some species that we really think a lot about, like wood thrushes. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit, where we just have large population responsibility. But again, we're looking at almost a 20% decline in forest birds in eastern forests since 1970. And if we look at some of these species, and these are trends for West Virginia, but I would doubt that they'd be very different in other states. You can see this reflected in breeding bird survey data. This is a survey every state does, and it's been going on since the 60s. And you can just see this chronic long-term trend in decline for these songbirds that are really what we consider indicator species. On the top is wood thrush. On the bottom is a bird that many of you might not have heard of, called the cerulean warbler. Again, I'm going to talk much more about this bird. But again, if across the board, you can see these types of patterns of declines. That's not to say that there aren't species that are increasing. There absolutely are. I think we can, or many people in the room can remember when hearing a raven in the Appalachian Mountains was quite a thing. And these days, at least in West Virginia, they're ripping windshield wiper blades off of cars and parking lots in Charleston, to make their nests. So there are success stories here. That's not to say there aren't, but if you look at it as a group, the picture is not so good. If we look at grassland birds, the picture is even worse. In that, if you look across North America, more than half of our grassland birds have been lost. A lot of that has to do with habitat loss, but there are lots of other things as well. Here in the east, one of the key indicator species for quality grassland is eastern meadowlark. And again, here we can just see these trends of declines. This is West Virginia again, but since '66, when the breeding bird survey started, you can just see that inexorable drop. And part of that is the fact that West Virginia, like a lot of states, have been experiencing farmland abandonment over many years and decades. And that means that there's just simply less habitat, but there are other factors at play as well. Another bird below is the grasshopper sparrow, which is a pretty sensitive species specific to hayfields and pastures, and they're much more scarce than they used to be. So what do we do about it? How does conservation work at the state? I won't belabor this too much, but every state has what's called a state wildlife action plan. It's a master guidance document. Usually it's assembled and administrated by a state wildlife agency. So that would be Maryland DNR, Pennsylvania Game Commission, West Virginia Division of Natural Resources. Most people aren't aware that a lot of the money that state wildlife agencies use to do their work are federal dollars, and they're called state wildlife grants. And in order to get those grants, we need to submit a state wildlife action plan. Happens every 10 years, and all of us are, or most all of us are in the midst of working on our third plan, the first one being 2005. But again, if we look at the plans, they vary across states. But in West Virginia, or everywhere, I guess, it's organized around this concept of species of greatest conservation need. And I don't expect you to read this laundry list of birds on the left. It's just to indicate that for West Virginia, this is our list. But I've highlighted in red the species that are priorities that I'm going to be talking a little bit about today in terms of private lands management. For us, also, a part of the plan is designating conservation focus areas. That's the map on the left. What are the key landscapes? What are the key places in the state where there's a lot of conservation opportunity? And when we look at the state as well, we realize that traditionally we've thought about public lands as the big opportunity for enacting conservation on the landscape. And it's true, here in West Virginia, we have more than 500,000 acres of wildlife management areas. And it's easy to enact management on those properties, but we're not going to really move the ball if we don't really get busy on private lands. And so we've been working with partners to increase the efforts that we make on managing on private lands. A lot of that is with partnership with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS, and their programs that target Farm Bill dollars to incentivizing private landowners to get management done on their property. Again, this is something that we've been working on here in West Virginia since 2012, but other states have similar programs. So I'll say that private lands and private forest management is our single biggest priority in West Virginia right now, at least in the non-game world, for enacting conservation. And on private properties, there's often a lot of opportunity to get work done. And you can have a lot of birds and a lot of opportunity on an individual property. So this is a farm down in Pocahontas County, West Virginia, one of my favorite places. And up on the slope, you've got key species breeding like cerulean warbler and wood thrush. In the margins, I've been on this farm many times. There's golden wing warbler, which I'll talk about a little bit more, just a very rare and declining species, but we've got grouse, turkey as well. In the interface in the savanna, we've got a bird called a loggerhead shrike, which is incredibly rare in West Virginia. And in the grasslands, we've got eastern meadowlarks and others. So there's a lot of opportunities, just indicate there could be a lot of opportunity on an individual property to get work done. So a bit of shameless promotion, particularly for those of you in West Virginia. We published our second state breeding bird atlas in 2021, and it was a comprehensive effort to map and catalog all the bird life in the state and get measures of occupancy and density and things like that. Pennsylvania, and I think Maryland just finished their bird atlas, and Pennsylvania is in the midst of their third. But that's all to say, when I'm going through these species and what we're doing, some of these maps are generated from atlas data, and I encourage you to check out the books from your state. They're really great references for bird life. So when we take a look at wood thrush, we're going to get into a little bit of habitat metrics here. I'm going to be working from mature forest, mature closed canopy forests to what we might think of as old growth forests, to early successional forests, to grasslands. But I'm going to tie this all up in the end in an interesting way. But if we look at wood thrush again, I keep coming back to this bird because it really is kind of a keystone species in eastern forests. If you look at West Virginia, we have approximately 10% of the global population breeding in West Virginia. And if you expand that out to include Maryland and Pennsylvania, you have roughly a quarter of the global wood thrush population breeding in these states. And they really are an indicator of quality forest habitats. You can really point at some serious issues, particularly with understories, when you're looking at declines of this species. So when we're looking at these indicator species, I also want to point out that they're often really good best management practices or management guidelines for these species. So often as private landowners, you might be working with professionals, but that's not to say you can't take a look and learn from these documents in terms of what the ingredients are that make quality habitat. But if you're looking at wood thrush, they like a mostly closed canopy forest, but they really benefit from creating small openings in that stand to get daylight down to the forest floor, to get some understory structure for them to nest in. Obviously they really respond poorly to invasions of species like Japanese stilt grass, which for those of us in the forestry world is an absolute nightmare. Also one of the key threats, and I'm going to kind of duck, please don't throw anything at me here. One of the key threats to understory songbirds, period, is an overabundance of white-tailed deer. They browse out the understory and they synergize with invasive species. So I encourage all of you to get your antlerless deer harvest completed every year. But then if we move on from wood thrush, which is a mostly closed canopy, mature forest, that deep, dark forest that we all kind of envision in terms of quality forest, and start looking at the forest that I think about a lot is this open canopy, old growth structure type forest. I think about cerulean warbler, and this bird, if we had a state bird that's not the northern cardinal, like pretty much every other adjacent state, it would be cerulean warbler. We have more than a third of the global population breeding in West Virginia. And again, if you expand that out to include Maryland, Pennsylvania, which also have this species, that number only increases. It's our single biggest priority, and the species is not entirely, but really benefits from timber management to create canopy gaps and a well-developed understory. So again, there are great best management practices for this species. They're available, and it's really just a great cookbook for creating habitat. Really, when we think about it, if you have a forest on your property and you've got a completely closed canopy, in a loose sense, you can think about removing about half the trees to create cerulean warbler habitat. They like basically a mid-level shelter wood style harvest is what we call it. We want to promote the forest understory, and a whole bunch of other species respond to this management. So when we look at cerulean warbler in the overstory, we get other songbirds that are threatened, like Kentucky warbler, which respond strongly in the understory. You also can get game bird species response, like turkeys and grouse in some cases as well. So I was asked to include this species, this is kind of a beloved bird here in Appalachia, the eastern whippoorwill. And I get so many calls every year, people super excited about hearing whippoorwills, and gosh, they haven't heard whippoorwills on their property in many years, and what's going on with this species. And the truth is that the whippoorwills are declining. They're experiencing a chronic decline like a lot of other species. Whippoorwills kind of have a variety of habitats they use. They'll nest in open understories in forest, but they forage and hunt along forest edges in early successional habitats. And they go after nocturnal flying insects, particularly large moths. There are a number of reasons why the species is declining. I'll get into a couple here that we can think about in Appalachia. But when we're thinking about benefiting this species, we're thinking about creating that interior forest edge. And through forest management, that might be small patch clear cuts within a forested landscape. It might be doing what other folks have already talked about, this notion of feathered margins versus hard edges. Hard edges are never preferable compared to doing what we call, there's another word for it, is cut back borders, to basically feather the edges to create young forest habitat at the edges of forests. But this is a picture of the type of landscape that you might find whippoorwills in, farms and fields, but mostly forest, and folks are hearing them singing from the from the forest edges or in the forest, or sometimes on top of their front porch, keeping them awake all night. But again, whippoorwills are really responsive to the right kind of management, and it's something that we're just really starting to think about. But also, if we're thinking about whippoorwills, one of the couple things that come to mind that that are really potentially threatening to them. The first is that it's not well quantified yet, but there's a suspicion that there's been a chronic decline in insect abundance, and this might apply also to nocturnal flying insects like these large Saturnid moths that they predate on. So we always try to encourage folks to consider alternatives to pesticide use, for example. They also really can be common along roads and can be subject to vehicle collisions. These are just kind of these types of threats that we think about beyond habitat for the species. But if you look at the occupancy map here on this slide, you can see that West Virginia we still have a ton of whippoorwills, and other states aren't necessarily as lucky, but we have areas where we have quite a bit. And matter of fact, if some of you were here last night, or you're going to be staying tonight, I encourage you to go out at dusk and walk around. You will hear whippoorwills at this park. So moving on, moving quickly, I know time limited here. One of the species that we really think a lot about with early successional young forest is golden wing warbler. This is a beautiful little songbird that breeds in Appalachia in increasingly small numbers, winters in Central America to northern South America. And we're channeling a lot of farm bill dollars towards managing for young forests to incentivize landowners to work with this species. But if we think about golden wing warbler, type of habitat that we create, if you look at it, is this great open canopy early successional habitat that we would expect other species to possibly respond to, notably American woodcock and ruffed grouse. So one thing I also want to drive home is just because you're managing for game birds or just because you're managing for non-game birds, it doesn't mean that the others are not going to necessarily respond. And there's an art to creating this habitat, and there's a creativity to it. Working with practitioners and professionals, you can really get some interesting work done if you think about it creatively. So just like with ruffed grouse, we think about golden wing warblers with an elevational threshold. In this case, it's not mosquitoes that we're concerned about. It's hybridization with the closely related blue wing warbler. There's a whole lot to say about that I won't talk about, but I don't want that to be limiting either. Anywhere that your property exists, generally speaking, can benefit from creation of young forest habitat. But they like these scattered large trees for song perches. And when I see this type of habitat, it really makes me happy, particularly if it's within a otherwise forested landscape. Finally, the last species I'm going to talk about a little bit about, this is getting into grasslands and working farms. So if you have a working farm, particularly if you graze cattle or you have hay fields or things like that, is to consider what you might do to improve your habitat in a grassland landscape. There's a couple key actions. I'm gonna talk about loggerhead shrike here, which is a very unique bird. Unfortunately, Pennsylvania and Maryland rarely have shrikes. We're kind of the northern terminus of the species, but they're really interesting in that they're a predatory songbird. It's about the size of a robin, but it goes after all kinds of prey that would shock you, to be honest. But they have a habit of impaling their prey on barbed wire fences. So I have a picture of grasshopper sparrow that was impaled on a barbed wire fence in Greenbrier County, West Virginia. But for us, it's an indicator species, and that wherever the shrikes are, and we only have 30 or 40 pairs in the state, is the very best grassland habitat. So it's kind of an indicator. But it is in steep decline, just like other species that we're talking about. And just want to highlight that the types of things you can consider when you're thinking about your farm management. The first thing that I always say is to think less about aesthetics. There's a lot of value these days in the neat and tidy farm, which is fence and grass and fence and absolutely no vegetation structure other than that. And if you look at the picture in the upper right here, there's a great pasture here, but you have ingredients that make it look a little messy. Makes what I call it is a heritage style farm. It's got some structure to it. It has some standing snags and some shrubs and some rocks and things like that. But those are the very features that a lot of species respond to. And if there's one species that overlaps with shrike, even though it's not necessarily something we think a lot about in West Virginia, is bobwhite quail, for example. There can be some intersection there on those farm landscapes. So again, just think about the habitat elements that you can include and how you might be creative about it. So this is where it gets complicated. And this is where I'm just going to talk really briefly about the importance of a landscape approach. Okay, we think about birds breeding in just these one place. The wood thrush is a bird that breeds in mature forest habitat. If we make that habitat, everything will just be totally copacetic for wood thrushes. Or the golden winged warbler, we might think that the species breeds in early successional habitats, and if we just create that habitat in and of itself, they will be totally fine and everything will be copacetic. It gets really complicated though, and particularly this has been highlighted in research in the last couple of decades, that wood thrushes, they arrive on their breeding grounds, they nest in this beautiful dark forest and fledge their young from the nest. But guess where they go immediately after that happens? They go right into what you would expect to see golden wing warblers in. They go straight into young forest habitat to forage and to gas up before they begin their southbound migration. So a mature forest bird nests and then it moves post-breeding, it disperses into that young forest habitat. So it's not just that you have to have one type of habitat, you really ideally have both of those habitats. And if you look at golden wing warbler, it breeds in early successional habitats, but post-breeding, before it disperses for its southbound migration, it goes into mature forest habitat and it moves around. And so this is all to say that you have to have a landscape approach, that just because birds use one habitat during one part of their annual life cycle doesn't mean that is categorically the habitat that they use throughout the year, or in our case with these neotropical migratory birds, what they use during the breeding season. And so if you think about a landscape approach, one thing to keep in mind is that disturbance has always been a part of forests and healthy forests. And these birds evolved to use a landscape that had disturbance. It wasn't just a forest primeval with a closed canopy, wall to wall, just a sea of trees. That was never what it was. And if you look on the left, this picture is an aerial of Cranberry Wilderness in West Virginia. This is a 55,000 acre roadless wilderness area, Monongahela National Forest. And if you look at it, it's pretty much an entirely completely closed canopy. And when you look at that, like, oh wow, this is untouched. It's beautiful, and it's true. When you hike in these forests, it's absolutely gorgeous in there. But what the backstory is, 100 years ago, there wasn't a tree standing in that wilderness. It was the timber assets in West Virginia were liquidated 1880 to 1920. And so this is actually a regenerating forest, and a regenerating forest that in a large part has not yet reached its stage where you're starting to have blowdowns of old trees and other disturbance processes that would create openings and gaps in young forest habitat. So you don't really see those features yet for Cranberry Wilderness, and there's no management happening there because it's a federal wilderness. You can't go in there and do timber management. If you look right next door, you have 300,000 acres owned by Weyerhaeuser, which is an industrial forest landowner in West Virginia, and they're in the business of cutting trees, just like, ironically, us wildlife folks are, at least for birds. And if you look at this, on the face of it, people, from a value perspective, often think that clear cuts are ugly. They think that forest management just creates scars on the landscape and all sorts of other problems. If you had to guess, which of these two areas has higher bird diversity and in a lot of cases higher bird abundance? It's going to be that managed landscape. As a matter of fact, Weyerhaeuser has probably higher grouse densities than anywhere else in West Virginia, maybe even central Appalachia. I mean, it's incredible, the densities of grouse. This is all to say, think about the perspective here. Think about the landscape. If you look at this Weyerhaeuser property, you've got mature stands all the way down to fresh clear cuts, which, by the way, in year 1 and 2 have Another threatened bird that we don't think as much about, field sparrow, they come and colonize these early harvests. And as the forests grow, the species assemblages change, but you have this constant supply of young forest on the landscape. And so that's the impetus for us to do the work we do, is to get this management done, and private lands are key in doing that. So again, I'll just highlight there are federal programs to assist private landowners. Other folks are going to get into that, just highlighting, just some of the slides that I use for West Virginia, highlighting these programs. I doubt there's time for questions, but if there is, I'd be happy to take them.